Hey, everybody. It's the Line Podcast, recording this one Friday, September 20th, and what a week it has been. Lots happening on federal politics. Can this go on? I think it can, and I'm going to tell you why. Jen, not so convinced. We're going to get you caught up on an asset management plan that Jen has some problems with. Don't worry, it's not as boring as it sounds. It's actually really interesting. A bit of a scandal of a kind brewing in the media. We're going to tell you all about that. And of course, Operation Grim Beeper. All that and more on the latest episode of the Line Podcast.
This episode of The Line has been brought to you by Unsmoke Canada. Canada can be a global leader in reducing the harm caused by smoking, but it requires actionable steps, including giving adult smokers the information they need to choose potentially less harmful alternatives. Learn more at unsmoke.ca.
Jen, I want to start just by telling you something funny. And we talked about this last week or the week before. I don't remember which, but I was telling you about like the great booze freakout in Ontario and how the Presbyterian Puritan Brigade was losing their minds that you can now buy beer in a convenience store.
I presume that all hell has since broken out in the streets of Toronto more than usual.
It's a nightmare. The living envy the dead. One of the things that keeps happening, and it's coming from, and I'll be polite, I won't name them, but it's coming from a few particular social media accounts. People are boosting, I heard from a convenience store owner about teenagers came into a store and bought beer and then drank it in the parking lot.
You know, I missed those days when teenagers did that. That was a healthier time.
It was. And it's just like, the funny thing is people don't finish this, like, go on. They're not like, oh, okay, and what happened next? Like, the fact that a teenager would have a beer in a parking lot is supposed to itself be A, a disaster, and B, proof that beer in convenience stores is a failure. Couple of days ago.
Are they then going on to socialize like normal human beings and have sex? Because that again, we're stepping up. We're stepping up from the current state for most teenagers if that's the scenario.
Well, we can't have that.
I'm going to argue for more teenagers getting illegal beer and drinking in parking lots. I think that is I'm all for that plan.
So it's funny you mentioned that. I'm going to tell you another story in a minute then. But okay. So the one I was planning on telling you about was I was grocery shopping. And for my Toronto listeners, it was the Metro at Bayview and Eglinton. Mm-hmm. And there's a beer store in the same complex. So it's kind of right on the corner of a major intersection. It's a big parking lot. There's a grocery store, there's a burger joint, and there is a beer store and a gas station, kind of all sharing the same like square of parking. Mm-hmm. And I had just come out of the grocery store and I walked back to my car and I threw the groceries in the trunk and my son was with me and we hop in the car. We're about to like kind of back out of the spot. And this woman walks out of the beer store, which is again, what apparently was the holy grail of alcohol moderation and regulation in Ontario. This woman, middle-aged, not young, and well-dressed and everything, she walks out with one beer, immediately cracks it, and just stands there like 6 feet from the door and just goes, go, and just kills the tall boy. And then she sort of casually looks around, finds a recycling bin, throws the beer into it, and walks away. And I was laughing in my car, and she was looking at me because there I am sitting like 10 feet away from her behind my windshield laughing. I wanted to take a picture of her, but I thought that would be creepy. But if I had taken the picture, it would have been her guzzling a beer in a parking lot with the beer store logo perfectly framed behind her in a landscape photo. So that would have been really, really funny. And people would have been mad at me for tweeting that, but I wanted to. And the other funny story I had was I was at a park in Toronto. This was on Wednesday. And you were talking about, are the teenagers having a drink and then having sex? So I was at a park and I was with my son and some of his friends and some of the other parents. The parents are standing around talking and the kids were all off playing. And like a completely middle-aged couple snuck into the bushes. I'm thinking,
wow.
Yeah. Okay. Like no judgment, but Normally,
No,
he'd grow out of that.
I'm judging a little. I'm judging a little. Anyway, everything's
You know,
fine.
to be clear, lest I create any rumors, they were not people that I was hanging out with. It wasn't like friends of us. We don't know who these people were, but me and some of the other moms and dads are sticking around. And this couple kind of walks by, and I noticed them because they were looking at us. And I was like, why are these people looking at us? And I think we were in their path. And then this middle-aged couple just sort of gives a polite nod, and they just walk right into the bushes. And about half an hour later, they just
this is
walk
what
right
happens when the teenagers stop drinking and having sex in parks. It's like the natural order of things is upended. The natural order of the world is upended.
Then you've got the upper middle class, middle-aged people sneaking into the trees.
Yeah, there you go. That's what I'm saying. Anyway, let's talk about the confidence motion now.
I don't want to.
We have to.
I don't want to.
No, I do. It's funny. It's very, very funny.
Oh, is it?
So yeah, it is. No, it's highly amusing. So as we have been talking about for the last few weeks, the very predictable thing has now happened. The Conservatives have announced that they are going to use their opposition day to launch a confidence motion on the government. Tuesday, I believe this is expected to fall. They're keeping the wording of it very simple. Just we've lost support we've lost confidence in the government. And of course, now they're going to shoot the shot and see what the other parties are going to do. Now, my suspicion is that the NDP is probably going to abstain, which won't save them from the brutal mockery that they will have inevitably brought upon themselves by continuing to effectively support the government after claiming to have torn up the confidence and supply agreement a few weeks ago. Interestingly, it looks like the Bloc is saying that it will support the government. They will vote against the confidence motion. And God bless Blanchette, the leader of the Bloc party, who said now very openly, like, we're just gonna get what we can get here. They're gonna treat this like every single confidence motion like a smash and grab in a down market Montreal dépanneur at 2 a.m. Like they're every single opportunity and bit of leverage that the Conservatives give them, they're going to use to now try and leverage gains financial benefits and concessions for Quebec. Sounds like potential. Why wouldn't they, right? And I like I said, I kind of have to respect Blanchette for being very open about the degree to which he's treating this as a transactional. Like, there's no interest in the national good. There's no interest in supporting the government because he supports it. It's straightforward. No. We're going to use our leverage to get special privileges for Quebec, which is an exceedingly openly transactional model of confederation. I would like to eventually talk a little bit deeply about the impact that has on the concept of the nation. Because it's every time that they do this, it damages our concept of an actual in it together nation state just a tiny little bit more, in as much as there is one left.
Bloc's the only party in the country that can officially not care about that.
That's right. So like you gotta respect the openness now. But also, what's very interesting is that the provincial leader of the Bloc in Quebec, so Legault, is now going to his federal counterpart and saying, vote against the government. Yep. So it looks like there's now internal tension within the separatist bloc about whether or not they should continue to prop this up. And I think that's a really interesting thing, because it does suggest to me that there might be the Bloc actually now might be taking damage internally for supporting the Liberals, to say nothing of the damage that the Liberals will be taking in being propped up by the Bloc. So this is kind of an interesting problem, because I think what might be happening here is that the Liberals have bottomed out in terms of their unpopularity. And as people get angrier and angrier and angrier, they're not going to take their anger and dissatisfaction out on the Liberals, because that's bottomed out. Instead, they're going to take their dissatisfaction out on the parties around it. It's kind of like a metastatic kind of problem, right? So it's angry now. More and more of the anger is going to get filtered by the NDP and the Bloc, because people are just so pissed and fed up with this bullshit. I don't know if that's going to turn out, but that's what I think is going to happen. So I think that the odds are right now, and I'm sorry, I think a lot of people in our comment section will be disappointed to hear this, but the odds are high right now that the government doesn't fall on Tuesday. I don't rule out the possibility that just crazy random shit happens, and who knows? Like, we are very much into who knows territory now, but the odds of them surviving this confidence motion are reasonably high. The question that I have is, right now, the incentives for the Conservatives are aligned in such a way that it's not like they're just going to stop at this confidence motion and then go, okay, well, business as usual. all of their incentives are now to try and use every procedural opportunity that they have to pass confidence motion after confidence motion after confidence motion after confidence motion, because all of their incentives are aligned that way. Every time that they fail a confidence motion, they gain attention now, they gain momentum, they gain support among their base who really want to see an election, and they're going to get frick tons of fundraising dollars every time they try and unsuccessfully try to pass a confidence motion. So they're going to keep on pressing this button as long as it keeps giving them the fundraising and dopamine hit that they're looking for. Like, I'm not even talking about this demonstrates lack of discipline from the Conservatives. Like, the game theory is set at this particular moment that there is no reason for them to do otherwise. Okay? Like, Singh set this up for them and set a chessboard where their moves now are very obvious in terms of what they can and should be doing. So they're going to keep on passing confidence motions. So then the question is, how many confidence motions can they reasonably pass before the next break in Christmas? And how many motions can they potentially pass before the next spring supply motion? And if the government manages to survive that, how many confidence motions are the Conservatives going to, like, how many times can they keep pressing the red button and get the return? And that's where things get really crazy. Because, okay, maybe the Liberals negotiate with the Bloc on this confidence motion. Then what is it, 3, maybe 4 weeks before the Conservatives get another opposition day where they pass it again? Okay, what are the Liberals going to give up to the Bloc or the NDP on the next confidence motion? What are they going to have to give up on the next confidence motion after that? And the next confidence motion after that? And the next confidence motion after that? And how are people going to, how are the polls going to respond to each of these parties as they continue to prop the existing Liberal government along? Like, will it, if we create this weird scenario where the Bloc, because it's getting so many concessions, their popularity is skyrocketing among their base, but maybe Singh's popularity is bleeding, then what happens? Right? Like, this gets really interesting really quickly. And as a result, I think that we're in full chaos territory. And I think we're going to be in full chaos territory straight until the next election, whenever that is, whether that's before Christmas, next spring, next October, or even later if they try and pull some really weird shit about with the fixed election legislation. So that, I think, is the state of play right now. It's getting really, really weird. It's getting very chaotic. I'm expecting nothing productive to get done for the next year in Parliament. And it's getting so weird, Matt, that, like, and it's getting weird in Canadian politics when the Americans start paying attention. It's like when I start Googling Justin Trudeau and I see like NBC stories come up, and I'm seeing like Wall Street Journal stories and New York Times stories come up about the twilight days of the Liberal government, which was, I think, the headline on a recent WSJ piece. Like, that's usually a sign that things are getting interesting and weird here, right? Because normally the Americans don't care about us at all. So anyway, that's kind of my take on the state of things at the moment.
Yeah, and I think we're largely in line. I had a series of conversations this week with different people, different parties, different roles in Ottawa, and all of them sort of had a visceral sense of disgust. Like, this is gross, it's juvenile, it's pathetic, it's not in the national interest, we're not going to get anything done. The voters aren't going to benefit. People who are in sort of the comms at the GR sector are saying my clients are not going to get any attention paid to their actual priorities right now because nothing's happening. So I think everybody's disgusted. And people kept saying some variation of, this can't go on. This is not sustainable. This can't last. And I think that's my feeling too. But I'm trying to red team myself or devil's advocate myself a little bit, because I want to lay out the case for yes, it can. So the case that this can't last is easy. Pierre Poilievre and Jagmeet Singh almost came to blows apparently in the House this week.
Yeah.
And I asked a friend of mine who's in the House, how long until we go full Taiwan and there's chairs flying across the aisle, and I was told we were pretty close once already. Yeah. So I think I'm with you.
Which, by the way, just as a pure journalistic chaos agent, I highly support. That's amazing.
I would be appalled / thrilled if it came into an actual brawl in Parliament.
That's right.
I've told you this before. I was at the Leaf game where the Leafs lost to their own Zamboni driver.
Mm-hmm.
And I was absolutely appalled and so grateful to be there. Because I just knew that what I was seeing was just magnificent dysfunction, and an all-out drag-em-out brawl in Parliament would probably, I think, make me feel the same way.
Yeah. And I think honestly, the entire nation needs it. I think we need a brawl. I think we would all feel
slip off into the bushes or have a brawl.
That's right.
Maybe
like
both.
I said, this is what happens when teenagers stop drinking.
So look, I think I'm with the consensus on this can't last, but counterpoint, just counterpoint. Sure it can.
Okay, but also I'm going to play to that counterpoint as well. If you are so locked down in your bunker mentality that your position is that a Pierre Poilievre government is the beginning of the end for Canadian democracy, and these people are the bad people, they're the MAGA conservatives who are going to destroy the nation, then not only can you survive through dysfunction and incompetence, you have a moral duty. You have a moral duty to drag this out as long as you possibly can, because every month that Pierre Poilievre is not in power is a month where the country is saved anew.
There are 40. There are 4. I don't know why I went 40 there. I was off by an order of magnitude. There are 4 political parties that are actually relevant to this. Sorry, Greens, but who are you kidding? It's the Bloc.
It could come down to it.
And the Conservatives are the ones who have an explicitly clear agenda of triggering an election as soon as possible. The Liberals have an equally explicitly clear agenda of avoiding an election as long as possible. The Bloc and the NDP, they're free agents.
Well, but their incentives are going to shift every week.
And 100% that could gravitate to this doesn't last. I remember around the time Aaron O'Toole got turfed as Conservative leader, when I was talking with Conservative MPs after, I was told by one of them that the party had become so toxic and dysfunctional. There were people who were probably actually on Team O'Toole who eventually agreed to oust him because they couldn't stand another day of the dysfunction. And I don't rule out Parliament as a whole getting to that point. But what I'm also looking at is a scenario where the Conservatives are the only ones who are 100% locked in on wanting an election, and they don't have the votes. So they're going to need either the Liberals to drop the writ, or they're going to need both the NDP and the Bloc simultaneously to agree to join with the Conservatives. And I can see a scenario where this government goes as long as legally possible, because you need to get the NDP and the Bloc at the same time and place in the space-time continuum. They both need to simultaneously choose that they are personally going to benefit from an election. Maybe. And until those stars align, it's not going to happen.
Maybe, unless the other possibility is that party discipline in one or both of these parties collapses.
I know.
In which case, you do have, the Pierre Poilievre and Singh got into blows because Pierre was claiming that Singh was only dragging the government out until I think February, when his pension kicks in. I think you'd be naive to say, of course, that's probably one of the incenting factors here. I also think that probably Singh doesn't need to just make that consideration for his own sake, but also for all of his party members.
Sure.
So that's a possibility. So like I said, just for that reason alone, it's not wrong to point out that a spring election is more likely than a fall one. I do think that's possible, because I think once everybody locks in their pensions, or a significant section of the MPs lock in their pensions, which comes, I believe, again in February, there's a non-zero chance that inter-party discipline collapses and enough people just stay home, call in sick, just abstain. It's just, you cannot underestimate the possibility of chaos here. But I don't know if that's going to happen. Nobody can know when or what's going to happen. The other thing, of course, that the incentive for the Liberals to drag this out as long as possible is that their assumption here is that they can come back from this.
Yeah.
Yep, they can come back from this. Trudeau, if we just Trudeau harder, if we just fix our communication strategy, That will close a 20-point gap at the end of a 9-year government. This is delusional. That's completely insane. But enough of them believe it, then it doesn't matter if it's delusional, right? Then the other thing I would say is, okay, that's a possibility, but what is it gonna? I mean, again, we're going back to the conversation we had last week. What's the material cost of dragging this parliament out, of keeping the bad man out of power? How much is it going to cost you, both materially, financially, and in your souls, to do nothing but that, because you have no legislative agenda. There is no vision. You're not forwarding any legislation of any serious contention in this particular environment. Like online harms is not going anywhere. And then what other big signature legacy things are you really committed to getting through the House in the next year? It's just, this is fantasy land. So the only reason to continue dragging this out is to try and keep the bad man out of power. And it's going to cost you more and more and more and more and more to do that as this drags on. At a certain point, somebody's going to crack. I just don't know when it is.
Interesting this week. I'm sure you noticed it. I didn't really comment on it, but interesting this week to see an obvious different tone from the Liberals. Mm-hmm. Much more, I don't want to say offensive as in rude. I mean, offensive is on the offensive. Like they on the attack. We'll put it that way. Really going hard on
what Canada really needs is just more aggressive Justin Trudeau. That's what we're looking for. We don't know it yet. That,
though. Like, it was Karina Gould. It was Mark Miller. It was various PMO types talking about
the A-team.
Talking about, Pierre Poilievre's misogynist hashtags and his plan to destroy healthcare. I get it. Like, I know what they're trying to do. But you're going to go to someone who has decided after 9 years of Justin Trudeau that he hates your guts. And you're going to go, well, hang on, do you know about Poilievre's hashtags?
Did you know that he had a bad hashtag on his YouTube videos?
Was it a hashtag or the metadata or something like that?
It was
in
the it was a hashtag in the metadata. Yeah.
And the idea that there is more than a handful of voters in this country who would slowly lower their fuck Trudeau banner and be like, wow, tell me about the hashtags. And then at the end of the conversation, be like, I had no idea. God.
Yeah, you know what? I think that's even also, we're not even talking about the fuck Trudeau flag people. It just demonstrates how completely out of touch you actually are with where people's are at and where their heads are at and what their concerns are, that you're fixating on Pierre Poilievre at all. Right? Like, they don't care about your internal bun fight or your internal bullshit ideological Twitter nonsense with Pierre Poilievre or the Conservatives.
They're voting against Trudeau.
My grocery bills have gone up 20%. Dude, like, people can't eat.
Yeah, but MGTOW, Jen.
My kids can't afford to live near me. My family's separating as a result of the housing situation.
Yeah, but don't you know about how big Poilievre's pension is? And he lives in a mansion.
Oh, and by the way, I was going to talk about this. This is something that I pinned Anyway, housing starts. This one started to make the rounds. Even though we're dealing with like record high housing prices that keep on going up and up and up, which is giving a clear price signal to developers that we need more supply, radically more supply, housing starts are declining. Oh. And they're not declining just in Ontario or Vancouver. They're declining literally everywhere. So like the housing supply, so despite the fact that we have like all of our governments working hard to try and create policies for housing issues, actual housing supply is collapsing. Housing starts are collapsing. Now, housing start means like how many people are actually starting to build new houses, which will come online in a couple of years. So I asked some of my people who are in that space, like, how is that possible? How is it that the prices keep on going up and up and up, and yet no one thinks that they can make profit on houses that they start to build now? That seems insane to me. And the general answer was that it has to do with some regulatory stuff in terms of how banks finance new builds. Like in Canada, we've got really conservative banks who will not finance new builds or big construction on big condo units, for example, until they have like 70% of these things pre-sold, which is a very conservative way of doing it. And then the other problem is the developer fees are now the million and one cuts. Sorry, it's death by a million cuts in terms of the developer fees and the regulatory fees and the regulatory hurdles that people have to go through at the municipal level is just jamming so much cost into the cost of a new build that it's gumming up the works. And as a result, we're now not only we have radically more people who want houses who can't afford the houses that exist, which is causing like the prices of the houses to go up to absolutely mind-bogglingly unreasonable prices. So there's that, which has downstream effects on family cohesion, class mobility, all kinds of on everything. It puts pressure on literally everything. But at the same time, even though you're getting these huge profits off these properties, the pipeline for bringing new properties in is stalling out and collapsing, which is going to throw the supply and demand, like the supply and demand curves are just totally out of whack.
Our housing crisis is now so bad and dysfunctional that the normal rules of supply and demand are breaking down.
Yeah.
Existing homes are in incredibly short supply, and therefore demand is high, which means prices is high. Basic economics. But what normally would happen under basic economics is that the market would therefore create more supply to meet the demand.
Sure.
And eventually price equilibrium would return. This is basic Adam Smith stuff.
Yeah.
But the regulatory side and also some of the, like you talked about the financing, there's also actually hurdles. Just literal the monetary policy where the interest rates have gone way up and inflation for building materials has been high and skilled labor is much in demand. Yep. Where the financial picture for builders who are looking at a 2 to 3 year horizon between, hey, like we're beginning work on this subdivision and we'll sell the homes in 2 or 3 years. They're looking at the price uncertainty of the actual construction costs. They don't have a lot of economic or monetary certainty about what the economic environment will be 3 years when the houses are ready to sell. Building the homes is a risk. So we are now in a point where the most precious asset in the land is too risky to make more of. It is insane. I don't know. You know what? I'm going to rephrase that. I know exactly how we got ourselves here. We probably should not have.
Yeah. So then the other thing that I think people also don't understand, and again, these are the people who rail against the 3% profits of the grocery chains. You know what I mean? Like this is the thing that I don't understand. Capital allocates itself according to return. Okay. So this is, again, basic things. So say you have $1 million and you want to invest it in something. Are you going to invest it in something that gives you a 3% return, a 10% return, or a 20% return? So it's not even a matter of does this particular asset class provide a profit? It's does the asset class provide me a better profit than the other places that I could hypothetically put my money into?
Sure.
Right? So this is something that if you are a builder or developer and you're looking at this going like, well, you're selling these houses for $1 million a piece. How could you not be making a profit? It's not even a matter of what kind of profit. It's can they make a reliable profit that is high enough to be competitive with other types of investments they could be making that will provide a more reliable profit. Right?
Like that's about this in other podcasts. Where is all future Canadian economic investment going? Not in Canada.
That's right. We're seeing huge capital flight. And these are the sorts of reasons why we're starting to see that. We can talk more about economics if you want. There is some economic good news that I do think, because we do get hard on the Liberals, that when we see something positive, I think it's worthwhile to note. And that is, we did get figures this week that demonstrated that inflation is now back to 2%, which is back on target after a couple of years of just being wildly out of control. We had at least one economic data that suggests that inflation is coming back into norms. Again, the Liberal government does not control the Bank of Canada's borrowing rate. I feel like this is a point that needs to be made for both Conservatives and Liberals. Like this is supposed to be an independent agency, but it does look like the recent moves that they made, they bet well, and we're now back to a more sane inflationary environment. That doesn't mean that the cost of groceries is going down, but it will cease to go up. It just means that it's stabilizing, right? That's good. It's good news, and I think that it's worth noting that it's good economic news. Is it good enough to change the polling numbers for the Liberals? Not even remotely. It's not going to turn the ship for these guys. Things would have to get things would have to get so radically better than they are right now. Stabilization is not going to be adequate to turn around the polling numbers. I really don't think it is.
I was looking at Professor Gordon at Laval, who was saying this week that wages are now actually growing fast enough to begin to erase some of the losses we've all taken in terms of real wages because of inflation for 2 years went faster than wage growth, but now wages are catching up. So things will start to feel better, but that could take years.
Well, decades. And let's also point out that, we're only now, I saw a chart today. We're only now catching up to real wages as they were back in 1976. So 1976, we were on this growth trajectory, and then we basically crashed through the 90s. Real wages crashed through the 90s. They start to turn around sort of in the 2000s, and they've been slowly growing ever since. And we've now kind of caught up to the trajectory of where our wages were in 1976.
That's fun. I hadn't seen that. That's exciting.
Yeah. So let's.
Yay.
And, the 70s also, in case for people who weren't around in the 70s, I wasn't, but the 70s weren't great for Canada. They weren't awesome. Anyway.
Oh, you know what? Okay. I was trying to remember what Jimmy Carter called it. The Great Malaise, the Great Malaise across the nation. You know what's cool though? Jimmy Carter, he turns 100 in 10 days, October 1st.
Cool.
So I don't want to get Betty Whited again. I'm rooting for Jimmy.
Yeah, there you go.
He would be the first U.S. president to hit 100.
Do we want to talk about anything else with regards to the confidence motion or economics? Because we do want to talk about the next thing on our list, but I think we should put a like and subscribe.
The only thing I'm going to add, and it's more just an observation than a comment. I was telling you a minute ago about the Liberals being fired up this week, kind of like that on the attack against Poilievre. And we talked in our last dispatch about kind of the Liberal strategy is apparently we need more monotonous social media content and more Justin Trudeau. I have doubts that that's going to be a good plan. After the by-elections this week, where they went basically as expected, Justin Trudeau, the morning after in Parliament, scrummed a bit and gave some comments. I'm always reluctant to comment on the personal appearance of politicians because that shit can get ugly. He didn't look well. He looks tired. Mm-hmm. And this is a guy who's, say this very neutrally, he's had a wild tenure in office. He's had to do a lot of stuff. But I remember writing this in a column about the Liberals, on a dispatch about the Liberals more than 2 years ago. It was kind of, I keep referring to this and I'm going to be obnoxious about this until the election's here. But in one of our dispatches, we nailed this in 2022. And one of the things I wrote then was that these guys have no doubt been exhausted for years because they had Trump, they had COVID, they had Russia, they had inflation. But they didn't usually look and act tired. The Prime Minister looked tired this week. And it could be as simple as he didn't sleep well the night before. But I think when we talk about our chaos theory, sweeping Parliament and how anything can happen, I want to underline the human element. Just because we're talking about chaos and a lot of actual kind of game theory, electoral calculations. Remember that these are human beings. Mm-hmm. And human beings under pressure can do stupid things. And maybe it's like we were saying a minute ago, maybe somebody throws a chair across the aisle in Parliament, or there's a brawl out in the halls outside.
Can they throw chairs? Can they throw chairs, or aren't the chairs nailed down? Anyway, you know,
where there's a will, there's a way. But we're just at the point where don't ignore the human element of how weird this is. And I think the Prime Minister is actually pretty disciplined. If anybody's going to crack, I wouldn't bet on it being him. No. But I would bet on someone cracking.
Yeah, I mean, the other interesting thing to note was you saw the clip from about Jagmeet Singh was making the rounds this week. So this is
when he confronted the heckler.
Yeah, so the protesters were confronting him, and he went all full alpha male and kind of told them off.
I thought he handled it really well.
He handled it really well. Also, I think he's playing the hits for sure. He does really well when he's being confronted by black hats, evil racists, whatever, and then he projects strength in that space. Again, how does that kind of, and again, a couple days later, he's almost picking a fight on the House with Pierre Poilievre. So he might decide that being, how should I say this, extremely embracing toxic masculinity might be a winning vibe for him. And if that happens, well, then where does his internal calculation go? Right? Like it's interesting.
Imagine 12 more months of this.
Oh, it's going to be great. No, we're here for it. We're strapped in.
We're here. Like,
here
yes,
we are
but also
now.
no.
Entertain us.
Nirvana. Good for you. I was not thinking Nirvana this week. I was thinking Gladiator. Are you not entertained?
Mm-hmm. I like it. Yes, we are.
Yeah.
We are very much enjoying our position in the stands. It's great. Love that here.
It's such a weird time because it's incredible gossip and drama, but also I'm a little bit embarrassed for everybody.
Oh, I'm not. Are you kidding me? But then I'm a chaos agent. I love this stuff. Anyway, I think we should put a pin in there and say like and subscribe. Like and subscribe. This episode of The Line has been brought to you by Unsmoke Canada, which is dedicated to helping Canadians who are looking to quit smoking understand the full range of options available. Despite decades of government programs and regulations, today nearly 5 million Canadian adults smoke cigarettes. Adult smokers who choose to continue to smoke should be aware that other options exist. Right now, accessing information about these options is heavily restricted in Canada. While not risk-free, alternatives such as heated tobacco and vaping products provide a potentially less harmful choice than cigarettes. Cigarettes burn tobacco, resulting in smoke that contains 6,000 harmful chemicals that are associated with smoking-related disease and death. Heating tobacco and vaping products have the potential to significantly reduce this risk. Health agencies around the world are now considering these alternatives to help end smoking. Updated laws can help adult smokers better understand the full range of options available, including the relative risk of these products. Millions of Canadians smoke cigarettes. Technology exists that can help change that, but policymakers need to take action. Learn about how a smoke-free future can be achieved at unsmoke.ca. So, Matt, I don't know if you saw this. The Logic came out with a very interesting story this week, and it found that a fairly massive asset management organization called Brookfield is trying to convince the government to essentially backstop a fairly large multi-billion-dollar fund. I think they would raise most of the funds for this through private channels, but they're looking for the government to pony up, I think, about $10 billion, according to the Logic story. And like, I know less about the ins and outs of higher finance than you do. But I think it's worth noting a couple things with this story. The first is that it comes on the back of Chrystia Freeland coming forward and starting a working group to look at the possibility of shifting the Canadian pension fund's mandate from just seeking profits for its clients, which in this case is all of us as Canadian citizens and potential future pensioners, and moving them toward reinvesting in Canadian companies for the benefit of kickstarting the Canadian economy. Nobody really stops to ask in the process of that examination why Canadian companies can't attract investment, just because they're providing the best returns, in which case there would be no need to create a working group. The CPP would have every interest in investing in Canadian companies because they were the best investments. We'll be getting back to that in a moment. I've said before that I think any attempt to move the Canadian pension fund away from a seeking maximal return type strategy to a reinforcing an oligarchic douche state type strategy it's a bad idea. I think that's a bad idea. And the people who will most benefit from that kind of arrangement will be the people who are already, let's just say it nice, maximizing the benefits of living in a highly oligarchic and regulated society. So the existing wealthy, and the people who stand to lose the most from that strategy are pensioners. So, your call. The other interesting thing to note in this, of course, is that the person who is the chair of Brookfield is Mark Carney, who has recently been appointed by the Liberal Party to serve as an economic advisor for Justin Trudeau. Now, we should put a caveat in all this. I don't want to get hysterical about this because, as far as we know, we're still in proposal phase of this. The government hasn't committed to providing any funds to Brookfield. They shouldn't. Brookfield is perfectly capable of generating investment and interest through private channels. It shouldn't need to lean on government connections to do that.
It strikes me as, I know we've already dropped the like and subscribe break, but I mean, it's a little bit of a reprise of what we were talking about in segment one, which is incentives, right? The government has, the current government and previous governments, because it's not like the federal government was a virgin on this one until Justin Trudeau came along and seduced it. Federal governments in Canada interfere in the market. They invest, and they always have. And you want to make a conservative squirm, get them on record and say, hey, do you want to kill the regional development agencies and look at them die inside and resent you for bringing it up?
Mm-hmm.
So our federal government's meddle, and exactly in the same way that the NDP and the Bloc are now positioning for advantage. And I'm even said, like, I'm not even talking about Mark Carney here. Like, I'm like, we will assume for the sake of argument that Brookfield is acting as any other comparable entity would, in line with its own incentives. Why wouldn't they see if Ottawa would chip in billions of bucks? Ottawa's shown they're willing to do it. Why not?
They've thrown through $13 billion in subsidies in EV development.
Yeah.
Now, the other thing I think is important to understand,
people are going to include Ottawa as, and maybe to your point, Brookfield absolutely 100% can go out and raise this money. Absolutely. But why not put Ottawa at the table and see who will give you the best deal? Because like you were saying a minute ago, right? It's all incentives.
And if you're telling me that Ottawa is going to invest in this capital and get like a 20% return or something, and that benefits taxpayers, that potentially is not a bad thing. The problem is that I think we're going to start to see what we started to see with the development of stadiums across the country. Right?
You know, when we're recording this, actually, it's funny. Me, the hockey fan, I think Ottawa's making their announcement today.
Yeah. So firstly, I just want to start and explain to people. I mean, there's been a great John Oliver segment about this, but like, it only took one sports team to realize that they could blackmail their local municipality or their local state or provincial government into massively subsidizing their private company to build stadiums under the guise of infrastructure before that became the norm right across North America. And now, a city can't not invest in a private stadium.
Wow! I just peeked in. I opened a different tab as we are talking right now. We're breaking the fourth wall. As we are talking, the Ottawa Senators are announcing they have reached a deal with the National Capital Commission to build the new home arena for the Ottawa Senators in downtown Ottawa.
Right, because now this has been normalized, right? Because now the teams all understand that they can blackmail their respective jurisdictions. They can blackmail taxpayers by saying, "Give us the cash, or we take the team." Right? They all understand they can do this, and they do. And because once one domino started to fall, it became the norm. And now it's really, really hard for any city to say, "Yeah, no, you're a private company making billions of dollars. You can build your own goddamn stadium."
We end up with billionaire sports team owners hitting up city council for $100 million.
That's right. And that's what's happening. So my concern here is that you have that sort of norm start to be replicated with massive asset management firms. That is going to happen. And let's also be really clear about what Brookfield is. Part of Brookfield's aim and part of their business strategy is through their American asset firm, which they recently purchased. They buy up distressed assets, strip them for parts, and take the profit, as we've seen in many other companies. I'm not even tarnishing Brookfield for this. I mean, this is a very normal strategy. So now we're going to say this ostensibly Canadian firm is going to take Canadian taxpayer funds. Like, we're not talking about them investing it in mom and pop shops or investing it in Canadian growth in things. Or they're not necessarily going to take that money and purchase some really wholesome, Quebec maple syrup factory, so the maple syrup factory can expand itself. That's not how modern finance actually works most of the time nowadays. No, you'd be giving Brookfield as a parent entity more money to play with, where they can essentially buy up distressed assets to strip for parts. And many of those distressed assets won't be Canadian, I would imagine. Right? So let's be real clear about what the game they're playing is here. And who I've gone on this rant before that increasingly Canada is what I call the octopus economy, where your ability to survive and become wealthy within this economy has less to do with how efficient or effective your ability to engage in businesses is. Instead, it has much more to do with how well connected you are politically with the various forms of government.
Sure.
Because if you're well connected with the various forms of government, you know the correct civil servant to tap with your lobbyist in order to get preferential regulatory treatment, or you know how to get on the correct lists so that you become a preferred vendor for federal government contracts that pay wildly above market rate. That was essentially the ArriveCan fiasco. And that's how the economy increasingly works. And what happens is over time, you develop a super anti-competitive economy. That's already happened. Canada's competitiveness is tanked. Because if you're a startup who doesn't have the correct political assets and connections, you can't get above a certain size. There's just
we took the old boys network, moved it inside the civil service, and unionized it.
That's correct. Yeah, that's effectively what we've done. And then now the end result of all of this is we have an increasingly oligarchic business elite that is self-serving and operates in its own interest and does so with the full blessing of government.
Industry of any kind, finance, natural resources, banking, tech, whatever, and the federal government are locked in a codependent relationship, and there's a thriving sector of professional services of all kinds that sustain and facilitate the links between them. Yeah. And then meanwhile, you and I over here are podcasting in our basements.
Yeah, precisely. So what's
and by the way, the funny thing is, Jen, you and I podcasting in our basements, we're doing relatively well compared to we're doing fine at a daycare.
Yeah, except for, yes, we are. So I've got no complaints. But at the same time, if you and I were in an American, much more competitive American environment, somebody would have come up and said, here's your $2 million. Do you want to expand this and turn this into an actual building? That money doesn't exist here in Canada because that's the consequence that people don't necessarily see in their everyday lives, is that when you live in essentially an oligarchic kind of business elite country, sooner or later, your productivity and your competition starts to fall through the floor. Your dollar begins to tank, and we're already starting to see that happen. And then when the dollar tanks, your comparative purchasing power relative to your American peers also tanks. So it's now costing you twice as much money to get half as much goods as somebody living, a couple hundred miles south of us.
And we're shocked our productivity's bad.
Yeah. And meanwhile, your wages aren't going up fast enough to make up for that. So what happens here is that essentially the middle class collapses and the quality of life that you're in collapses, while at the same time, the people who are in that corporate business elite are getting wealthier and wealthier and wealthier relative to the rest of the society. So I don't want to sound like a rabid leftist here or anything like that, but I mean, look, there's also a conservative argument to be made that this is bad. This isn't a good outcome for anybody. And a lot of it has to do with the way that the corporate union and business interests have become.
I should have mentioned union because I mentioned industry and government. I should have mentioned labor.
Well, look, I actually have a lot more sympathy for example, trade unions. For example,
sure.
I'm happy to have a steel worker make good wages, good holidays, and create a situation where the employer can't take advantage of that person. I think unions are very valuable in that subset. The problem here is that what I think you have is a lot of, I kind of ranted about this in last week's Dispatch when I talked about the PSAC, which is the public sector union here in Canada. A traditional union is predicated on the ideas that we're going to use our collective power to get our share of private profit, right, for the workers. Great, correct, good argument. That's correct. You're using your collective power to take advantage of, to fix the disproportionate power between employer and employee in order to generate more wage benefits for employees. I think that's correct. That is the correct way to go about it. A public sector union doesn't exist like that because there is no private profit in that circumstance. A public sector worker union is trying to use their collective power to gain more access to taxpayer dollars. And where do taxpayer dollars come from? Other workers.
So you're just the last 2 minutes to watch Jen become a communist.
Well, except I'm not, because I'm saying
there's on you. Didn't even see it coming.
Well, no, but I'm saying I don't think that we can be treating private sector workers and public sector unions as the same thing. They're not. Private sector workers exist to extract more rents from private capital. Public sector unions exist to extract more rents from other workers. They're parasitic by nature. And I don't have a problem with that necessarily if they're working to provide better quality or reasonable quality working conditions for public sector union workers. Where they start to become a problem is when you have public sector workers who are now better compensated, wildly better compensated sometimes, wildly better protected sometimes, and have wildly better access to amenities and vacation benefits than any comparable public sector worker, while at the same time radically expanding the size of your overall public sector, which is what's happened since 2015. That now becomes an inherent problem, and then it becomes part of the octopus economy problem that I'm talking about, that stifles innovation, stifles productivity, stifles all this good stuff. So, like, that's the imbalance that we're struggling with at the moment. That's my opinion. And as I said, I'm really looking forward to some economist professors arguing with me about it. That's going to be really fun. For the record, I'm no longer on Twitter. So
Jen didn't even notice during that segment the two guys in like ski masks wearing old East German fatigues holding AK-47s and a big Red Army faction flag setting up behind her. No, look, yeah, sure. Yeah, okay. I'm going to go with that. You really kind of ran with the Brookfield thing.
Well, didn't I just? Was it? But to me, it's like, look, in and of itself, is it a huge deal? No. But my concern is that it sets up a precedent that all of these other enormously powerful, influential companies are only going to copy and follow, which will set up
precedent's set already. I don't think Brookfield's the first mover.
No, it probably isn't. But that's the concern is that you set up a norm where the government is going to backstop private capital, right?
I think we're in the phase between.
And in time, that's not going to benefit the taxpayer if that's the norm you set up. Because if you're going to have the federal government backstopping private capital and getting a 20% return, that's great. But if you create a norm where all of these asset companies are now saying, you backstop me, or I'm taking my show to a more competitive, more impressive jurisdiction, now all of a sudden your 20% return is going to become a below market 3% return, and your federal or loss even. And now the federal taxpayer, the taxpayer, you and I are going to be sucking up the bill to make these assholes wealthier and wealthier. That is not sustainable.
The background to all of this, and I would say on the normalization front, I don't know yet if it's fully normalized, but I think we're somewhere between fully normalized and unprecedented. Like, I think we were already kind of moving towards normalization. You had said at the outset that I know more about the finances stuff than you do, and I probably do, but I don't think I know a ton more than you do, because it's not my bread and butter. But I do know enough about this to know that one of the really interesting issues, and I'm putting this in a non-political way, here's one of the really interesting issues that faces governments all over the Western world. We've all heard the cliches, right? Aging population, living longer, aging in place, blah, blah, blah. The pension funds were set up to deliver a certain amount of returns for a certain number of years. And whether it's because of the population side dynamics, people living longer and increasingly unhealthily, because like people in their 90s are burning a lot more money to stay healthy and in place than someone in their 70s. And someone in their 70s is more expensive than someone in their 50s. So as we age longer, it gets more expensive to sustain these people. The pension funds need to throw off cash. Like actual liquid cash. So it's not enough for the pension funds to have large assets. They need to have assets. So this is something I've talked quite a lot about with people who know about this stuff. It's not enough for a pension fund to own a large enterprise, a mining company or anything, unless that company is actually generating cash. So there's going to be an increasing scramble in recent years. There already has been in recent years, and there will be in coming years, for companies like Brookfield to do exactly what you were saying, which is to buy up. You said distressed companies, and that's part of it. But the big issue is cash generating enterprises here, because it's not enough anymore to kind of be, well, we've got our blue chip assets that are, they're stable, they're predictable,
Coca-Cola and McDonald's. Yeah,
you've got to go out and find the companies that are throwing off 10, 20% cash every year. Yeah. Because the funds need that to cover their liabilities.
Right.
So a company like Brookfield, that's the mission. They've got to go and get those cash generating assets. Where they come up with the capital is the other side of the equation, because most of when these companies are going out and assembling the capital to go and make a bunch of asset purchases, they have to pay that money back, and they can either do it with interest or they can do it with kind of like a shared dividend structure. So they need to find businesses that are generating enough cash to finance the costs of the acquisition over the long term, and B, on top of that, be generating so much cash flow that there's money left over to get everybody new hips and a nurse, or probably in 10 years, a robot to help them get in and out of bed when they're in their 80s and they have a hard time going to the bathroom on their own. Again, this loops right back to what we were talking about in the first segment. In Canada, the capital is flowing to jurisdictions where you can find those businesses that are growing fast enough to be throwing off those cash returns. We're going to have Canadian pensioners getting their home janitorial robots based on the profits being generated by entrepreneurs in Louisiana. And meanwhile, up here in Canada, I spoke about this. You know, John Michael McGrath, TVO. Mm-hmm. He and I were talking about this recently. And one of the things we were talking about was on my satellite radio show. If you went back in time and you gave me $1 million and you gave John $1 million, probably the smartest thing we could have done with that money would have been to buy a house in Toronto, mm-hmm. and then ride that return. You go to the Matt and John as they exist in Boston, St. Louis, Houston, Tucson. We're building a business.
You're building a business.
Exactly. In Canada, we're buying a home and then we're renting it.
Yep.
And then eventually, if things go really well, I'll pay off that house with the lease on it. I'll go in, I'll buy another one. I'll leverage the asset of that house to get to leverage a mortgage and to buy another house. I'll do it again. And I'm not going to get rich, but what I might do is give my kids a place to live. Because that's what the market incentive is in Toronto right now.
Well, okay, but that's how you created.
This is why the capital is leaving the country.
Yeah, but this is why you also have Canada's is increasingly a retirement facility. It's a retirement home. That's increasingly what we're setting ourselves up to be economically, right? It's being a perfectly nice place to take your nice, expensive house and retire in.
My friends
or sell that house and retire in. Like it's not a dynamic, innovative economy, and the end result of that is that, like I said, a lot of people are like, well, I don't care if I live in a dynamic, innovative economy, so provided I, have a nice life and I'm being taken care of. And I'm going like, yeah, your ability to have a nice life and be taken care of is directly linked to how dynamic the economy actually is. Because nobody, if you can't generate growing returns and growing assets, then essentially what happens is everything ages in place, and we start to see a collapse of those very beneficial assets like healthcare and pension funds. The other thing I just want to note about all of this is, and I think this is an important thing to mention when we're talking about the Canadian pension plan. I mean, I've mentioned this also when we were talking about Alberta was talking about creating a pension plan, and I was like, no. An Alberta pension plan is a bad idea for two reasons. One, you could never trust that an Alberta-run pension plan wouldn't wind up becoming just an opportunity for people in power to reinvest in the companies of their buddies. Okay, so
it would be the mid-23rd century, and the Alberta pension plan would be the last investor left in the last remaining oil pump in
That's
Alberta.
Right. That's exactly right. And again, great for the person who owns the oil pond in Alberta, not great for the people who are relying on that income generation to retire on.
The rest of us are in our fusion-powered space shuttles, but the Alberta Pension Fund is propping up the last.
Right. And the second thing that I pointed out when I was talking about the Alberta Pension Fund is the CPP actually does really well. The CPP, as it exists right now, actually is a strong performer. I talked to Trevor Choom about this, I think, a couple of times, and he's like, no, the CPP is a well-run, well-managed, one of the rare examples in Canada of a well-run, well-managed organization that is producing strong returns by focusing on a strategy that is not about nationalism and is instead focused on, no, we're going to put Canadian pensioners' cash, taxpayer cash, where it is most likely to get the best return. That's been the focus. So here's the two things why I think that's important to mention. One, there is no reason to change that mandate for the CPP. It's not like you can make an argument that the CPP is underperforming and so therefore we need to change the mandate. No, the only reason to change the CPP is because you have under-competitive, well-connected Canadian businessmen demanding that they get access to more Canadian capital and using their political clout and their political connections to try and get access to that capital to the detriment of the people funding that CPP. Okay? So that's the only reason to do it. So the other thing that I would say is that I thought that the Alberta pension plan makes no sense in the current arrangement where the CPP is independent and strong and producing good returns. You change that calculus and all of a sudden you turn a CPP that's all about providing a bigger investment pool for companies that will just happen to be centered in Montreal, Quebec, and Ottawa. And all of a sudden, the argument for Alberta sticking around in this game is nil. I say at that game, that's the game we get ourselves out, because that doesn't make any sense for us to play that game. So, going back to the idea that Canada's being reduced to a transactional quasi-alliance between increasingly bitter rivals, that I think would only accelerate that trend. Matt, I don't want to talk too much about business because it's not my forte.
Well, I'll just close with this. I am in my early 40s, and as you'd expect, my friends around the same age, guys I went to school with. And our kids, I have one friend who has a kid. One of my friends has the oldest kid of sort of the cohort, but she's only a few months older than my eldest. So my kids are kind of right up at the forefront. And one of my friends has a newborn. So we got, roughly speaking, kids between the ages of 0 and 12. We're in our early 40s. We're all settling in really nicely in our careers. As a group, we've done really well. And one of the things we are already talking about is where our kids going to live.
Mm. You're gonna put them to work in the retirement home?
It's just, I don't know, and I don't know the history well enough to speak to this, but I don't know if previous generation of 40-something men went out for a pint and a pound of wings. We're thinking in 10 years, our kids are going to be moving out. Where are they going to live?
I mean, the other thing I would say is this aside to that. I mean, you and I are probably borked because our kids are here. So we're probably going to be here for another 20 years because we've committed to our communities and all the rest. But if I were 20 today,
gone.
Yeah, I know. No way.
Yep.
Right.
Yeah, you're in Latin America. You're in Portugal. You're in Southern
Latin America,
United States. Portugal.
I'm doing that. I did leave Canada for a couple of years. I went to the Middle East for funsies. That was cool. But no, I mean, you'd be doing anything you could if you had ambition and talent. You'd be doing anything you could to get out of here, because it's not going to get. I don't see, even under a conservative government, the structural problems are so entrenched now that I think that even if you have a radical and reforming conservative government, which I think we need, it's still going to be 10, 20 years before we reverse some of these trends.
Poilievre has hinted in that direction, though. Remember a couple months ago, we talked about it when he was like, I'm not going to listen to the lobbyists unless they tell me how they're going to benefit the people. I think he's thought that through politically. But as you and I said on the podcast, right? Oh, okay, great. Start with cheese and get back to us. Like,
yes, please make it so that the biggest single item proportionally on my bill is cheese. I spend more money on cheese than meat. Like my cheese.
I'm not saying that was judgment. Like,
no,
I say that
I don't.
Approval, that's a lot of cheese.
I don't actually eat that much cheese, but like as a proportion of my bill, I spend more money on cheese than meat. That's wild.
Let's just say I have doubts that Pierre Poilievre is going to change that, or that he would refuse to take a phone call from, say, Enbridge. So
I also have my doubts. So anyway, if that's the case, then Canada continues to devolve into a retirement home.
You know what's great,
that's where this goes. What's great?
My wife was at a party last weekend, and everybody brought too much food, and they divided up the food so everybody could take some home, and my wife scored some pretty good cheese. That's
great. All right, we want to talk about the Grim Beepers.
Grim Beepers. Coming up next. Like and subscribe. I would like to show you something, Jennifer Gerson.
Show me. Why? But why? Why do you have an Apple Watch?
It's a gift. It's great. I use it every day. I like it a lot. You know what it has inside of it?
A bomb?
Battery.
Oh.
This week, as I think our listeners and our viewers, God bless you, will be aware. And if you aren't, check out readtheline.ca, where Phil McBride, a friend of the line, has written an analysis column of what happened in Lebanon this week. Through means that are not yet fully understood, Israel was somehow able to remotely detonate Hezbollah's communications equipment. This includes pagers, beepers, because Hezbollah had decided not to use smartphones because they were easily hacked. They deliberately went back to a dumber generation of technology for operational security. And based on what appears to have been, honestly, Jen, probably one of the most spectacular intelligence operations of all time, Israel was able to create a fake company that sold Hezbollah the equipment, probably at a profit. So Israel found a way to make a buck on it. And the equipment was sabotaged with explosives at a time of their choosing. Israel detonated them, these pagers. And what they did first, according to the reports, is they sent out a message so that everybody's beeper began beeping. And like human beings the world over, when something beeps, you grab it, you check it out. And a couple of seconds after the beepers began beeping, they exploded. Reports from Lebanon are that dozens or hundreds of Hezbollah members were killed. This was lopsidedly in their senior leadership ranks, because these are the guys who have the communication devices. Thousands wounded. The next day, Hezbollah switched to its backup plan, which was walkie-talkies, just ultra high or very high frequency radios. And the Israelis fucking blew them up too. And I honestly don't know how the hell they did that. Phil, in his piece, tries to explain how you could use radio signals to try and overload the equipment or remotely detonate them. Jen, honestly, and I'm saying this as a former and recovering military historian, the United States Navy reading Japanese naval codes in World War II, the Allies breaking Germans' Enigma codes, maybe the Soviets' penetration of MI5 in the 50s. This is an intelligence success on that scale. It is an absolutely spectacular victory by Israel. Unbelievable. Books are going to be written about this. But I also start to wonder, are you and I in 5 years going to be allowed to get on a plane with a cell phone, or are they all going to have to be put in some Kevlar bag, and when you land at your destination, the flight attendant hands them back to you?
You know, it will be very interesting. So do we know the amount of time that passed between them being sold these beepers and the beepers going off?
Apparently a matter of months.
Okay, because there must have been a concern that if they sat on this for years or too many months, that someone was going to discover something, because they were going to go to the airport. Someone would swipe the beeper with one of those explosive sniffing
little
equipments,
things, yeah,
and somebody was going to start to put two and two together, right? Like, I think the risk of discovery was probably not 100%, but probably was also not zero. So they probably couldn't sit on those beepers indefinitely. I think that this is probably one of the most spectacular targeted military campaigns in human history. I think it's the Israelis. I mean, just taking we're gonna have a conversation with the morality of all this aside, but just from a pure Machiavellian point of view, it doesn't really get smarter than this. This is the Israelis at their best, and you almost kind of wish, like, Jesus, could we not have done this for Hamas and Gaza? Like this would have been a better approach than death from above. Can we all agree? So, you know, I realize that there has been some collateral damage as a result of this attack. I mean, I hate to use jargonistic terms like collateral damage because it minimizes the human element. We know that there's perhaps one child who was killed as a result of these explosives. That's very sad.
There's reports that one kid grabbed daddy's beeper.
Yeah, that's very sad. I don't disagree with that's very sad. However, when you compare that to the potential damage that would have been done in a full-on war, or as it bombs from above, we can see what that looks like in Gaza. This is an infinitely more elegant and targeted operation than anything else. And like I said, I mean, I think the Israelis, rightly or wrongly, have a reputation for having some of the most advanced intelligence in the world. That is absolutely, especially when you're talking about a scenario where it's really easy for Israel to lose the moral authority or the moral ground with the world writ large, rightly or wrongly. Quadrupling down on your intelligence and your targeted attacks and that type of capacity is a necessity, and this is why. But just really, really, really smart. Now, as for the morality of this, personally, this is about as clean as war gets, folks. Like, I don't know what to tell you. Like, you know, a targeted explosive campaign in a communications network that they knew was going to Hezbollah's senior senior operatives and then people within the Hezbollah network. It doesn't get more targeted than that. As I said, your other alternatives are assassination point by point. Your other alternatives are bombing campaigns. Your other alternatives are invasion of Lebanon. Every other alternative is uglier, messier, and more violent than this. This is top tier, smart, targeted campaign.
People will, Jen, obviously they're going to draw their own conclusions about whether or not they can support this. But what I am going to say is that I'm simply going to remind people of the context of this, which is that Hezbollah has been firing artillery, rockets, and missiles at northern Israel since October 7th. And there are tens of thousands of Israelis who have been evacuated from their homes for almost a year now because of the constant air attacks, but also because of the concern the Israelis had, obviously, after October 7th, that if Hezbollah is actually a much more powerful fighting force than Hamas. Hezbollah is so big and powerful, it's almost straddling the line between terror group and nation state. Mm-hmm. Hezbollah's fighting forces are organized enough and powerful enough to effectively fight as light infantry units on Western models. They are very powerful. And Israel was worried that if Hezbollah launched some sort of invasion of the north, the IDF would defeat them. But in that time, how many thousands of hostages would be dragged back to Lebanon and recreate in the north what Israel already has in the south? So Israel's in a situation where tens of thousands of its people are internally displaced inside Israel. Hezbollah keeps firing, and Israel's had enough. I'm not here to debate the morality of this. I'm going to let people draw their own conclusions here. But I still, and I've told you this before, I still think there has been a failure among many Western observers to understand how radically Israel's internal calculus has changed since October 7th. This kind of operation is, in theory, the kind of operation that even reluctantly pro-Israel or even neutral Western observers would be able to support. And many of them can't. And it just reminds me of that old quip. Israel has a right to defend itself, just not with its military. So we grant the moral right for them to do it without the practical right.
Right. So, I mean, the other interesting thing I would say about all this, and again, I don't necessarily want to rehash what we've already gone over on in terms of what's happening in Gaza, which I do have some concerns and some real issues with. But the sort of people who object to a campaign like this are the sort of people who don't want Israel to win.
Yep.
Israel doesn't lose any clout, any political. Israel, I think, has lost huge political capital and goodwill among the world at large as a result of its operations in Gaza. Again, I'm not going to get into the morality of that at this particular juncture, but I think it's safe to say they have. But the sort of people who are going to object to sticking teeny tiny bombs in pagers that went to Hezbollah initiatives and say, well, that's immoral or that's indiscriminate. Well, it's not indiscriminate. It's exactly the opposite of indiscriminate, actually.
It is hyper-discriminate.
It's hyper-discriminate. In fact, that's what makes it so effective. But the sort of people who are going to object to that are the people who just don't want Israel to win or don't believe that Israel has a right to exist, don't believe that Israel has a right to defend its continued existence against existential threats. In which case, you don't lose, you haven't lost anything by alienating those people, right? You lose huge capital for what's going on in Gaza. You're losing no capital for a target like this. So
there was some really interesting videos have emerged of the attack. People had their cell phones going or security cameras running in public places when the pagers exploded. And there's something that I want to underline here. I mean, I'm not here to make an argument, but I want to tell you something. There's one of the videos is a security camera in a store of some kind. And it's a guy at the cash, and he's paying for something. It's not clear from the video. It kind of looks like maybe the pack of smokes, but it's not clear what it is. But he's at the cash, he's paying. And there's an old lady who's the cashier, and the dude suddenly explodes. And he goes down in agony. The old lady's not harmed. Find me another weapon system other than a sniper rifle that would allow a military target to be taken out, but the cashier he is handing money to be unharmed.
It's wild. That's wild.
So,
The other thing I would just say is just like, as for like, what's the security implications in the long run? I actually think the security implications for the rest of us is pretty minimal. And I think the reason why is because it's not like they could just remotely detonate these normal pagers. These pagers had been sabotaged, right?
Yes,
So
they've been implanted with explosives.
do I think a hostile foreign agent could hack into my phone, my iPhone, and make my battery kind of melt down? Probably. Could they make it explode to the point that it would represent a serious or fatal threat to me? Probably not. Just a normal phone. I think you would actually need to put some kind of explosive in the phone to make that happen. Just the physics of it, I don't know if it adds up.
Jen, all I'm going to say to you, and I agree, but what Israel was able to do here with the pagers was interdict Hezbollah's supply network, the supply chain.
Yeah. Which was where the real intelligence goes. Yeah.
Where do all of our electronic device supply chains originate?
Okay, so then that actually becomes the interesting strategic question about supply chains. It becomes a question of where are your citizens getting their tech from, and what are the protections and material sort of, not speaking correctly, what are the things that we're doing to ensure that those supply chains aren't corrupted by hostile foreign agents? I think that's
how many
that's
of the Joint Chiefs are walking around with a device right now that is at least partly sourced directly to mainland China.
But these are conversations that people should have been having for ages. I mean, these are conversations that we were having around Huawei's attempts to get into our business chains, right? Like, of course, we should be having conversations about the sanctity of our supply chains, and this is another reminder of why. Moving on. Anyway,
I don't know what this is going to do in the long term. I honestly don't. Like, who knows? But I think we've seen this week something new in warfare. Mm-hmm. I don't even look. I'm a guy who knows more than most people about this kind of stuff. I don't know how to describe this. I don't know if this was a cyber attack. I don't know if this was a kinetic military strike on a command and control infrastructure system. I don't know if this was an intelligence sabotage operation. I mean, yeah, it's all three of those. I honestly don't know exactly what this is because it's new. And it's a bit of a related story, and I won't go into any particular detail here because I'm just mindful of the time. But Canada recently held a major cybersecurity tabletop exercise. Mm-hmm. We didn't do well. And to be clear, that's the point of the exercise, right? Like you sure. want to fail in a tabletop exercise because that's where the benefit accrues.
Yes.
But I just thought it was such an interesting pair of headlines this week. One of them was that we kind of in a big tabletop military national security, cybersecurity exercise, Canada's not ready. And
that's a new thing for us. That's a real, we're not ready for some kind of military front. Yeah. Well, that's shocking. Breaking news.
Meanwhile, Israel has just debuted an entire new form of hybrid warfare. Imagine what happened. And I agree with you. It would be difficult. It would be difficult to remotely detonate the average dude's cell phone. I don't know if it's possible.
I don't think the physics makes it possible.
I agree. You could probably combust them.
Well, and exactly. I know that there was a thing, the Samsung phones a little while ago imploded, but they didn't explode. They
can blow up a cell phone in pretty spectacular circumstances. So there's a really interesting video. I don't know if you've ever seen this. It's very obscure. It's a guy at a gym, and it's from a home security. It's like a security camera, and he's lifting weights. And his cell phone pops out of his pocket and it startles him and he drops the barbell he's holding and the weight lands on the phone and the phone explodes because the impact of like the hard floor and the battery being struck. So you can blow up a battery. I just don't know if you can do it remotely.
Yeah. And also,
but
I'm
now
not sure.
half the physicists on the world are probably
exactly. I'm just not entirely sure if you could do that effectively enough to cause anything more than injury. You know what I mean? Like even when the Samsung cell phones were exploding, they weren't exploding to the point where somebody was spontaneously combusting. Like, you know, it was like I got my hand burned. I got my, you know what I mean? Like it's a different scale of a problem.
Okay. I'm going to do something I'm reluctant to do.
Okay.
I am often careful about verbalizing things I hope don't happen. Because you never know.
Sure.
who's listening. So I would like to ask any Russian, Chinese, Iranian state intelligence agencies to skip to the next segment here. Any ISIS or Al Qaeda members would also, I think you're really going to enjoy what we talk about in a couple minutes. So just skip ahead. A coordinated cyber attack against Western countries that knock out the 911 telephone system through conventional computer hacking, while at the same time, senior political and military leadership have their cell phones remotely combusted in the dead of night. Because I bet most of these people have these things charging at their bedside.
Yeah, so I mean, I could see a scenario where you're starting. The Prime Minister
wakes up and his night table's on fire, and he grabs the phone to call 911, and no one answers. And meanwhile, while that's happening, Taiwan suddenly reverts to Chinese rule.
I mean, yes, but these again, we're still in the realm of pretty conventional risks still. You know what I mean?
Second order effects are huge because
anyway, it's an interesting conversation. It brings a whole different dimension into the game on warfare and challenge. So anyway, I agree with you. It's interesting
because what how do you think Hezbollah feels today? Think about the psychological aspect of this.
Well, there's lots of psychological aspects. I'm not sure what your point is.
They're shocked. They're horrified.
Okay.
If you're Hezbollah, do you want to pick up a phone today? The psychological second order effects of what Israel has done might be bigger than the first order effects. And I think that's fascinating.
Well,
I don't think we've really wrapped our minds around that yet.
I also think the other thing that is probably going to happen is we're going to have to go to dumber and dumber and dumber technology to create secure lines. Right. So like we've become really dependent on digital technology, being able to, I don't know this, but I'm willing to bet that intelligence agencies that are still competent probably are massively overweighted to things like hacking, cybersecurity, those types of new next gen type of intelligence gathering. My guess is that if this has an actual second order effect, it's a revival of some of the dead drop 1930s, 1940s, 1950s
one-time
style
codes and things.
Being able to decipher and manage a code on paper. Being able to listening stations, using ham radios, those types of really dead old technologies are probably I'm just saying, I don't know. I wouldn't be surprised if classic intelligence techniques, meeting people in person, seeing them in person, having face-to-face conversations, secure locations, codes, handshakes, this kind of really old school stuff. I think I wouldn't be surprised if you were to start to see a revival of a lot of that type of spycraft.
About 20 years ago,
that'd be my guess. I don't know. Whatever. I'm not.
No, I think you're bang on. And
my understanding of this is pretty confined to a Le Carré novel. So there you go.
Well, here's the thing, though. I know a guy who provides high-level cybersecurity advice and IT support to a Canadian bank, and he's already telling them we should bring back like checkbooks. You remember those little things people would show up at the teller?
That's right.
You should everybody. When you do any banking transaction, you should have a printed record because one day we might wake up and the banks, all of their IT is just frozen.
Yeah. So then what do you do? Interesting question.
Did you watch about 20 years ago the reboot of Battlestar Galactica?
Yes.
I'm not going to bore the listeners with a big revival of it, but one of the themes of the show it's mankind builds robot servants, typical sci-fi fashion. They become self-aware. There's a war between man and the robots. One of the things the humans have done in that show is deliberately revert their technology to be less hackable.
Yes.
Where we actually roll back the technology to go a little more analog.
Or you just need to create secondary redundancies, analog redundancies, right? Like, okay, so what do you do if all of your digital networks get hacked? Well, then you've got to go back to analog. How is this stuff? How are we communicating in analog fashion, right? Anyway, I don't want to.
We should revert.
Yeah. Anyway, for a lot of different ways and a lot of different reasons, the internet is a bad place. Look, like and subscribe. We want to talk a little bit about media gossip, but I really don't want to spend more than 5 minutes talking about it because it's not that important. It's just funny. So like and subscribe and check out www.readtheline.ca. If you haven't already, please do sign up. Please do consider also buying a subscription because that's what keeps Matt and I afloat in this hyper uncompetitive, unstable world where we're going to have to revert back to analog technology. The newspaper's coming back, folks. Let us be at the forefront of it. So, Matt, you actually noticed something at friend of the line Justin Ling's Substack, and you mentioned it to me. Would you like to read to me exactly what Justin Ling has posted on his Substack so that we're not telling any tales out of school?
You know what? I'd love to. I don't have the tab open anymore, but no,
We can paraphrase.
Yeah, I'll tell the viewers and listeners what happened. Before you and I began recording today, I was plunked on my couch eating a crusty bun. I've been baking this week, and I'm doing a great job at it, by the way. And I'm just munching on a bread roll, basically, and I'm just reading, like, kind of just going through my inbox. And as you said, Justin Ling, friend of the line, has a new post out at his Substack, which, as always, we recommend, Bug-Eyed and Shameless. Check it out. He has a new post, and he's done an interview with the director of the controversial film Russians at War. And this has been controversial in the context of the Toronto International Film Festival. I'm not going to get into it. It's to the side of what we're talking about today. Before Justin gets into his interview with the director of the film, he made a point of kind of going, hey, just kind of like a bit of an update. And he announced that he has decided to leave Canadaland. Canadaland, published and owned or partially owned, I don't remember which, by Jesse Brown, a colleague of ours, is it's an independent media company, and they do a mix of written products and podcasts. And Jen, I've been a guest on Canadaland podcasts, happily so, and you've been a contributor there as well. Justin has announced that he is ending his relationship with Canadaland because in a recent podcast Justin had recorded, him and the guest made comments about the Gaza war that Justin felt were fair, but that Jesse Brown, as publisher of Canadaland, had edited out of the podcast. And Justin says that there was some back and forth between him and Jesse, and some of what Justin had thought should remain included, Jesse relented on and did include, but not everything. And Justin has announced that he is stepping down from Canadaland. The only other bit of context I will add is that Jesse is clearly in a difficult spot. And I don't know any of the inside gossip. You might know more than I do. I don't know any of it. But Jesse has taken a position that is more pro-Israel and I would say anti-Semitism than some of his staff at Canadaland feel comfortable with. I think Canadaland, you and I have talked about this before, Canadaland explicitly was catering to a left-leaning progressive audience. And I think Jesse, probably in his personal politics, generally is a left-leaning progressive, but not on Israel, not on anti-Semitism. And he's been obviously struggling to be in a different place philosophically, ideologically, and editorially than his staff. And he has been trying to navigate the tensions of that. The only comment I'm going to make, and John, I'll turn it over to you here, is based on what I have read. And all I've read so far is Justin Ling's statement. I think they're both behaving as mature adults. Jesse Brown, as publisher of Canadaland, has the right to exert editorial control over his products. And if he doesn't want to air something under his banner, as publisher, that is his right. And you and I, as co-founders and effectively as co-publishers of the line, I would feel comfortable exerting the same authority. But meanwhile, Justin, as an independent journalist, an independent commentator, 100% has the right to decide at a time and place of his choosing that he's no longer comfortable working for a company or an individual. I know this thing is likely to get, for people who care.
We put this at the back of our podcast for a good reason. Like this is very inside baseball, inside tea. So,
but for the people who care, this might get blown into a big deal because it touches on the bigger picture issues of the war, of allegations of genocide, all that stuff. To me, I boil it down, Jen, to very first principles. Two gentlemen have come to an agreement, and one of them has decided to walk away from his existing business relationship with the other. God bless them both.
Yeah, so here's another thing is not only was I a contributor for Canadaland for a while, but Justin Ling and I co-hosted a podcast called Oppo for a couple of years, way back in the merry old days of yore.
And puppies were the oldest animal.
Yeah. And I've, of course, kept in touch with Justin. He and I were brought on that podcast because we had different ideological perspectives. And the idea of that podcast is that those perspectives were to clash, right? And I think that it was a really fun podcast while we did it. We both kind of aged out of it for different reasons and at different times, but it was all very amicable. Like sometimes relationships end. That's how it goes. Or what you want to accomplish with a particular type of project comes to an end. Like not every podcast is meant to last for 40 years, right?
Not like this podcast, which is forever.
Yeah, exactly. We can keep going as long as there's a Canadian democracy to talk about. No, but I mean, Justin kind of reached a point with Oppo where I think that he wanted to do something more. He didn't want to just do a Canadian version of Crossfire. He wanted to do something that was a little bit more journalistic. He wanted to do more interviews. He wanted to do more of that kind of stuff. And I think that the perspective of Jesse on Oppo at that point was this was meant to be a bit of a cheap and a cheerful crowd pleaser. I had no problem with that. Like, if you want a cheap and cheerful crowd pleaser, let's do that. You want more journalism? Let's do that. Like, I was always pretty chill either way. But there, there was just kind of, it just didn't, I think Justin kind of aged out of it. Justin got he got a little bit bored of it, and he wanted to do stuff that was a bit more in depth, and God bless him too. He moved on. So there's some tea about Oppo. It's not very good tea because it's actually like completely professional and responsible. But anyway, so I know a little bit about the backstory here, but not enough to feel like I'm in a good place to make a judgment on it. I have written in the past, and we've done dispatches in the past about Jesse's position on Israel and Gaza. Jesse, a couple of months ago, in the wake of October 7th, started pointing out rank anti-Semitism that he felt was apparent and obvious in the progressive movement around him. This wasn't him demonstrating support for the war. This was literally him pointing to stuff that was happening in Canada, to the Jewish community in Canada. And the backlash he got for that was an absolute mask off, telling on yourselves moment, because there was a real sense from the people that he was talking to was, you have to get on board with our latest issue. You're not demonstrating solidarity to your team, to your tribe. How dare you point out rank anti-Semitism among your own? So there was a bit of, how should I say this? No one's hated more than a heretic. There was a bit of that vibe about it. And this all culminated with Jesse's own staff kind of openly rebelling against him and trying to make claims that their nation union somehow gave them editorial control to determine Jesse's right to express his journalistic values on some of this stuff. So, I mean, I thought that was appalling. By all means, if you're working for an employer, you can negotiate with your employer what you're comfortable with in that, in a highly charged, emotionally heated moment. But you don't have the right to use, going back to our conversation about unions, by all means, use your collective power to generate more wages, to generate better working conditions for yourself. Where I draw the line is when you're using your collective power to shut down other journalists. Like, that's now way over the line for me. And to me, that was where this was going. So they took real objection to what Jesse was doing, which in and of itself was horrific to me, because again, Jesse was not expressing support for the war. Jesse was calling out acts of anti-Semitism, which included things like firebombing synagogues and looting outside of Jewish daycare centers. And he was calling that stuff out. And I think to be objecting to, or to be defending those types of actions just demonstrates the point, right? So anyway, I was quite horrified by that. And my position on all of this is, if you have an issue with your publisher taking a stand against anti-Semitism in his own community, you shouldn't be trying to intimidate and bully that publisher into silence via your some kind of notion of union solidarity. You should quit. Like, if you have an issue with Jesse is doing, the correct moral action is to quit.
Do as Justin did.
Do as Justin did. So,
what would Justin do?
Now, what I think Jesse may have gone wrong here is, I believe at some point Jesse did step back and say, I'm going to take more of an independent stance. I'm going to allow my staff that I've hired here to have editorial control over what they're putting out. And I'm not going to exert editorial control here. So firstly, I think that was an error on his part. He shouldn't have done that. As a publisher, he has absolutely every right to dictate what gets published under the company he started and created. Fuck that. You and I are never going to step back and say we're not going to have editorial control over what goes under what gets published under the line, because not only are we morally liable for it, we're legally liable for it. So no, absolutely not. Jesse should never have agreed to do that. But having agreed to do it, it's a mistake to then renege on it. I think Jesse is entirely within his rights. Now, here's what I say. I don't know exactly what was cut, and I don't know the reason why it was cut. So I can't side on Jesse or Justin on this issue unless I know what was cut and why. Mm-hmm. But I would say that generally my understanding of the situation right now is that I agree with you. They're both acting like adults, at least in public. Jesse has every right to say, I'm not willing to publish that under the Canada Land banner. He's within his rights to do that. And Justin is within his rights to say, that's a violation of what I think is ethically appropriate or journalistically appropriate. And I am not going to continue to contribute to Canada Land under those conditions. Correct. That's the correct answer. And I have nothing but respect for both of them in those decision-making, in that decision-making metric. So until I have more information, I remain, God bless you both, and via con Dios to both of you.
Yeah, honestly, basically, I agree. I mean, as a general rule, I've seen what happens when newsrooms get restive. And my attitude in business and in life is to shoot the mutineers immediately.
Well, and you've learned from some experience there. But I mean, look, I think that you have to create a scenario in a newsroom where there's healthy dissent and there's healthy debate and conversation. Because a newsroom, it doesn't matter left, right, newsroom, whatever. You can't have a healthy, dynamic newsroom where I can't go to you, Matt, and say, Matt, I think that this is wrong and here's why. You can't. There has to be an environment where there's engagement and real, open, and honest conversation and debate on issues. 100%. What goes on A1? What's the framing of this? What is our framing of this? And that involves being able to have honest, open debates about tough shit. Yep. I think you need to create that. A newsroom needs to be, for lack of a better term, a safe space for that kind of dissent internally.
But at the same time, that has to happen in an environment where people understand who's the publisher, who's the boss, and who's the employee.
That's right. Because you can't run a newsroom functionally in a jazz hands collective environment. It's a hierarchy. Yes, you need to have healthy debate within that hierarchy. But at the end of the day, somebody needs to make the decision and someone needs to be the boss, and everybody else needs to make peace with that. Or they need to say, I'm going to quit and move on because I can't live with that under my own conscience.
When I, in my career,
it's the only way it works.
I've had moments in my career where my employers decided I was no longer a good fit for the organization and they escorted me to the door, and that was fine. Sucked in some ways, but it was 100% their prerogative. I have had experiences in my career where I have decided that someone else's services were no longer required and I've had to terminate their relationship, and that doesn't feel good, but I think it was the right business decision and I had the right to make it, and I made it. I acted within the bounds of my proper authority. And there have been times in my career when I've decided I don't want to work for these guys anymore. And I have handed in my notice. And in general, I've always been pretty good at staying on good terms with former colleagues, but I have never gone into an organization thinking that they owed me anything other than a paycheck for services rendered.
Well, and I think that this also gets into this idea that, okay, well, I'm an employee of a company, and it doesn't matter what your industry is. I'm an employee of said company, and therefore the company has entitled me to a living, and I'm entitled to act as ever I choose in exchange for that living. And to some extent, yes, there are obligations that an employer has to an employee, but there are also limits to those obligations, and there has to be limits to those obligations because otherwise an organization can't function. You can't, like I said, a newsroom isn't a democratic collective. It just isn't. It's a private company where ultimately somebody who has ideally worked their way up through the various ranks of jobs within the newsroom has to use their editorial judgment to make a call. And, you and I have been in many situations where we've disagreed with an editor about how something should be presented, or we've disagreed with senior editors about their decisions, but had to ultimately respect that it was their call to make. And that's just what it is. And the reason why it has to be that way is because when you're in a newsroom, you're producing 10,000 words a day, man. You're producing stuff at deadline every single day. You can't allow yourself to become hung up as an organization on ideological disagreements. You have to function. And the only way that I have found that works there is a boss is a boss, an editor is an editor. and you operate on the ranks down. Now, that doesn't mean I haven't had conflict with my personal bosses in the past or hadn't disagreed with them. And I've always been pretty open. Yeah, well, yeah, shocking, right? I've also been very open with my bosses about when I disagreed with them and why. And I've, and that's great. And there's a reason why I'm my own boss now. And it's a beautiful thing. It's a great thing for me. But that's correct. Like, I'm not entitled to work for a newsroom that heeds my every whim and does everything that I think is the correct answer all the time. That's not my entitlement.
Yeah, no, you're right. But here's the thing. You know what? 100% going to co-sign every word of that. I'm just going to add this. The fault of this is actually on the bosses. It's not on the employees. Now, the employees might have been whiny, delusional, entitled Gen Zers or whatever the Gen is now. Snowflakes, blah, blah, blah. I've heard whatever term you want to use.
But you hired them and you continue to employ them.
And you didn't fire them. When dealing with a large number of entitled snowflakes, never ignore the instructional power of thank you for your open letter decrying our editorial policy. The signatories are now free to pursue other career opportunities. Get back to work.
I'm sorry. I wish it were. I wish that humans were different than what we were, and that we could work in non-hierarchical collectives where all decisions were made by a group mind. If humans were other than what we were, that would be a beautiful thing. But we are what we are. And I think you have to work with the reality of what we are.
I also believe very strongly in the power of limited but demonstrative uses of authority is a good way to avoid indiscriminate uses later.
Yeah, I think that's probably right. And I think also I wonder, in Jesse's case, if he had taken a harder line a couple of months ago, if perhaps he would be able to be more flexible now.
Never too late to do the right thing.
On that note, look, I think we've had a long but fun podcast. I hope everybody's enjoyed it to the end.
I did want to sneak in one reference that I wasn't able to get in earlier. So obviously, as always, Jen and I would like to thank you all. We would like to ask you to share, to like, to subscribe. Help us out, guys. It's very important when people do click that like button or they do click that subscribe button, when they go to readtheline.ca and they actually click and they sign up for a paid account. These things are hugely important for us, especially given the weird times we live in federally. We've got a lot of work to do and we need your help to do it. So please do all those things. Tell your 100 best friends about us. Get them to sign up too as well. We're always growing. We're always learning. We're always trying to do more. And I will end, Jen, obviously, with a like and a subscribe and just a reminder that all of this has happened before and all of this will happen again.
Deep cut. Deep cut. Thank you again, everyone.
Today's podcast was brought to you by Unsmoke Canada. Now is the time to modernize Canadian laws so that adult smokers have information and access to better alternatives. By doing so, we can create lasting change. Learn more at unsmoke.ca.